Imagine walking into a courtroom, expecting to have the upper hand, only to be completely outwitted by your opponent, an opponent you thought was nothing more than an easy target. This is exactly what happened when Judge Amy Coney Barrett tried to humiliate Pam Bondi, only to realize far too late that she had underestimated her adversary. What followed was a twist that no one saw coming, and it's a story you don't want to miss. The stage was set for a high-profile legal battle, one that seemed destined to be over before it even started. On one side stood Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a highly respected member of the U.S. Supreme Court. Barrett was known for her sharp legal mind, impeccable qualifications, and an impeccable track record of handling complex legal matters. Her rise to the highest court had been swift, and her reputation as an intellectual force in legal circles was virtually untouchable. On the other side of the courtroom was Pam Bondi, a former Attorney General of Florida, with a well-established presence in the legal world, but one that didn't quite carry the same weight or prestige as that of the judge. Bondi had certainly made a name for herself during her tenure as the Attorney General of Florida, where she was known for her tough stance on issues ranging from consumer protection to high-profile political matters. However, despite her experience, she wasn't seen as a heavyweight in the same league as Barrett, a person widely regarded as one of the sharpest legal minds of her generation. In fact, many in the legal community considered Bondi's experience to be more political than judicial, and so when she was set to face off against Barrett in this particular case, no one expected it to be anything other than a formality. It wasn't just Barrett's legal prowess that made her the overwhelming favorite. Her extensive experience on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit had given her the kind of credibility few could match, and as a Supreme Court judge, she had the added benefit of a lifetime appointment, solidifying her standing as a major force in the legal world. Her sharp mind and quick ability to dissect complex legal arguments had earned her the respect of her peers and placed her on a pedestal that was almost impossible to challenge. In contrast, while Bondi was a seasoned lawyer, her expertise didn't carry the same depth or universal recognition as Barrett's. Bondi had handled her fair share of major cases, but many of those had been more about political maneuvering than high-stakes, legal intricacies. Bondi had not yet built the same type of legal reputation that would have put her on par with someone of Barrett's stature. To most observers, this appeared to be an open and shut case. Barrett's legal acumen was expected to dominate the courtroom, and Bondi was simply there to fulfill the necessary formalities. It was assumed that Bondi would go through the motions while Barrett took charge of the legal proceedings, as was customary in high-profile cases like this one. However, no one could have predicted what would happen next. As the trial commenced, Barrett wasted no time in taking control of the proceedings. Confident and poised, she quickly began to steer the case in her direction, expecting to have an easy time of it. She delivered her arguments with the sharpness and authority that had made her famous, presenting a well-reasoned, airtight case that she expected to be unchallenged. Her approach was calm, composed, and methodical as she dissected the issues before the court with the precision of a surgeon. But Pam Bondi wasn't just sitting back and letting Barrett take the reins. To everyone's surprise, Bondi stepped up and began to deliver her own arguments with a level of clarity and precision that none of the courtroom's observers had anticipated. Bondi wasn't intimidated by Barrett's presence or reputation. Instead, she took each of Barrett's arguments and dissected them with an astuteness that made the room sit up and take notice. Bondi's approach was different from the typical political posturing that many had come to expect from her. Instead of playing to the crowd or relying on rhetoric, she focused on the facts, the law, and the details of the case in front of them. Bondi wasn't just making general statements. She was providing specific legal precedents and citing case law that struck at the heart of Barrett's arguments. It was a far more intellectual and nuanced defense than anyone had expected. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Bondi's arguments started to take hold. Barrett, who had been so confident in her ability to win this case easily, found herself on the back foot. Bondi was engaging her directly, challenging her points with facts, legal arguments, and precedents that couldn't be easily dismissed. Every time Barrett tried to make a counterpoint, Bondi was right there, offering a response that made the judge rethink her position. What was even more striking was the manner in which Bondi handled herself. Where many lawyers would have floundered, or stumbled under the intense scrutiny and pressure from someone as powerful as Barrett, Bondi stood firm. She didn't back down or shy away from tough questions. She faced them head-on, offering reasoned, thoughtful responses that forced Barrett to reconsider some of her assumptions. It was clear that Bondi wasn't just another politician trying to win a case for the headlines. She was a legal strategist who had thought through every angle of the case and was executing her plan with laser focus. The courtroom became electric as the two women went back and forth. Judge Barrett, accustomed to being in control, began to lose her grip on the case. She tried to maintain her authority, but Bondi's methodical approach, grounded in solid legal knowledge, had taken the upper hand. Bondi wasn't just holding her own. She was making the case for her side with an effectiveness that Barrett could not ignore. In those moments, something began to shift. The courtroom was no longer just an arena where a battle between a Supreme Court judge and a former Attorney General was unfolding. It became a battle of legal intellects. Barrett had, unknowingly, underestimated her opponent. She had expected an easy win, assuming that Bondi's legal experience was inferior to her own. But instead, Bondi had turned the tables, exposing Barrett's vulnerability and showing the courtroom that, despite the judge's towering reputation, she was not infallible. By the time the arguments drew to a close, it was clear that Pam Bondi had proven herself as a formidable force in the courtroom. What was supposed to be a one-sided legal battle had turned into an intense intellectual duel, with Bondi emerging as the unexpected victor. The case, which many had assumed would be a mere formality, had proven to be a testament to the power of preparation, confidence, and legal skill, regardless of one's reputation or experience. In the end, it wasn't just the verdict that mattered. It was the fact that Bondi had managed to do the impossible. She had stood toe-to-toe with one of the brightest legal minds in the country and held her ground. The outcome wasn't just a surprise. It was a reminder that brilliance can come from anyone, even those who are underestimated. The story of this courtroom battle serves as a powerful reminder. Never judge a book by its cover. Even those who seem least likely to win might surprise you with their brilliance, and sometimes the person who appears to have the upper hand might not be as untouchable as they seem. Things started to take a strange turn when Pam Bondi was given the chance to speak in the courtroom. Judge Coney Barrett, confident in her legal prowess and the weight of her reputation, had expected the proceedings to go smoothly, with Bondi merely offering a few perfunctory statements in defense. Barrett had long been known for her sharp wit, her ability to cut through arguments with surgical precision, and her reputation as a force to be reckoned with in the legal world. She believed that she could quickly disarm Bondi, dismantling her arguments with little effort, just as she had done countless times before. But what Barrett did not expect was the sheer poise and clarity with which Pam Bondi approached the case. Bondi, who had often been seen as a more politically driven figure rather than a purely legal one, took a step forward and began to speak with an unshakable calmness that belied the tension of the moment. Barrett, with her usual self-assuredness, tried to dismiss Bondi's arguments before they even began. She offered a cutting remark, dripping with sarcasm, attempting to undermine Bondi's credibility and weaken her position in the eyes of everyone present. "Are we really going to go through all of this?" Barrett quipped, expecting Bondi to falter or lose her footing under the sharpness of her words. But instead of getting flustered or reacting with defensive rhetoric, Bondi remained completely unfazed. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of being rattled. Instead, she calmly and clearly began to outline her argument, one point at a time. It was almost as if she had been preparing for this very moment her entire career. She wasn't there to play the usual political games or to offer the kind of empty rhetoric that often plagues high-profile legal battles. No, Bondi's response was rooted in something far more substantial: facts, case law, and intricate legal theories that she had carefully crafted over years of experience in the legal field. At first, there were whispers in the courtroom. People couldn't help but notice that Bondi wasn't giving in to the usual courtroom theatrics. Instead, she was diving into the specifics of the case with remarkable clarity and expertise. Her approach was methodical and precise as she began to present her arguments in a way that was both articulate and intellectual. It wasn't just a general defense she was offering. It was a structured, nuanced response that hit at the heart of the matter. As Bondi spoke, she carefully cited legal precedents, bringing up case law that directly related to the issue at hand. She didn't just make vague allusions to past rulings. She brought the specifics to the table, referencing decisions and arguments that were deeply relevant to the case. She wasn't just offering generalities. She was presenting well-reasoned arguments backed by solid evidence. The effect was immediate and electric. The audience in the courtroom, who had perhaps anticipated a typical exchange of rhetoric, was now listening intently. Bondi was speaking with the kind of legal depth that demanded attention. Even some of the other lawyers in the room began to take notice, whispering among themselves. Judge Barrett, who had initially been dismissive, was now looking at Bondi with a new level of respect, though she wasn't willing to admit it just yet. It was then that Barrett, for the first time in the proceedings, began to realize that Pam Bondi was not the pushover she had assumed. In fact, she wasn't even out of her league. Bondi was holding her own and then some. As Bondi continued, it became increasingly clear that she wasn't simply trying to defend herself or her position. She was presenting a highly sophisticated, multi-layered legal argument that was both intelligent and compelling. Barrett, who had been quick to belittle Bondi earlier, now found herself having to reassess her initial judgment. This was not a simple defense. Bondi's argument had depth, layers of legal reasoning that Barrett had failed to anticipate. What Barrett had once viewed as a mere political figure now seemed like a formidable adversary. Bondi wasn't just pointing out flaws in Barrett's arguments. She was systematically deconstructing them. Each legal theory Bondi presented added another layer to her case, making it more robust and harder to challenge. The more Bondi spoke, the more the room began to take notice of the sharpness in her approach. Her delivery was confident yet calm, and her arguments were both pointed and precise. Bondi wasn't simply responding to Barrett, she was taking control of the conversation. She wasn't backing down, and she wasn't allowing Barrett's sarcastic remarks to derail her. The once imposing figure of Judge Barrett, who had been so quick to dismiss Bondi at the beginning, now found herself listening with increasing attention, her own thoughts turning inward as she processed the complexities of Bondi's argument. In the midst of it all, Barrett began to feel the slightest twinge of uncertainty. For someone who had spent years honing her legal skills, dominating the courtroom and making quick work of even the most challenging cases, the realization that she had misjudged Bondi's capabilities was unsettling. But rather than letting that feeling of unease paralyze her, Barrett doubled down. She tried to push back with more forceful interjections, attempting to regain control of the proceedings. However, each time she tried to discredit Bondi's argument, Bondi responded with equal force and an even deeper understanding of the legal intricacies involved. What was supposed to be a straightforward case, with one side dominating the other, had quickly turned into an intellectual battle. The balance of power in the courtroom had shifted, and what had once seemed like an easy win for Barrett was now anything but certain. Bondi, once underestimated, had skillfully turned the tide, using her legal knowledge to challenge Barrett's arguments in ways that no one had expected. The courtroom was on edge as Bondi's intellectual brilliance became more evident. Even the most seasoned legal experts in the room were beginning to appreciate the depth of her knowledge. What had started as a battle of wits had now become a battle of legal titans, and Pam Bondi was proving that she belonged on the same level as anyone in the courtroom, especially Judge Barrett. As Bondi continued to speak, the room became almost completely still, the weight of her arguments sinking in. Judge Barrett, who had once believed that her sharp wit and quick tongue would easily take down her opponent, now found herself on the defensive. For the first time in this case, it was Barrett who seemed uncertain, her initial confidence giving way to a dawning realization that Bondi was not just another opponent to be dismissed. Bondi was a legal force to be reckoned with, and Barrett was beginning to understand that this case would not be as easy as she had assumed. As the exchange between Pam Bondi and Judge Amy Coney Barrett continued, it quickly became clear that the battle was not unfolding as expected. Barrett, initially confident in her position, began to feel a shift in the atmosphere. The room, once brimming with the assumption that Barrett would easily win the case, now buzzed with a palpable uncertainty. The other lawyers and legal experts in the room, who had assumed that Barrett's brilliance would lead her to a quick victory, found themselves exchanging puzzled glances. Their expectations had been turned upside down in a matter of moments, and now no one seemed quite so sure about the outcome. Barrett, accustomed to dominating legal discussions and effortlessly dismantling arguments with her sharp intellect, tried to regain control by interjecting with more pointed, even dismissive, remarks. Her quick wit, which had always been one of her greatest assets, seemed to be faltering in the face of Bondi's calm, composed responses. Each time Barrett attempted to belittle Bondi, hoping to rattle her or provoke a mistake, Bondi remained, entirely unfazed. Rather than losing her composure, Bondi simply stood her ground, her demeanor steady and controlled. It was as if she had been preparing for this moment for years, knowing that her arguments would be scrutinized, but refusing to back down in the face of personal attacks. She had no interest in engaging in the political games that often plagued such high-profile cases. Bondi was here to fight based on the law, and that was exactly what she did. Each time Barrett sought to dismiss her argument with another sarcastic comment or another attempt to undermine her, Bondi responded with grace and intellect. Rather than retreating under Barrett's pressure, she rose to the occasion, countering each jab with a well-thought-out response that forced Barrett to pause and reconsider her approach. Bondi began to cite legal precedents with precision, calling attention to relevant case law that further strengthened her position. She brought up recent Supreme Court rulings, some of which directly contradicted Barrett's interpretation of the law, offering up evidence that clearly supported her stance. The face of Bondi's calm, methodical approach, Barrett's confidence began to crack. She had expected to handle Bondi easily, to brush off any of the arguments that came her way, but this was different. For the first time, Barrett found herself on the defensive. Every argument she attempted to make seemed to be met with a stronger rebuttal from Bondi. And it wasn't just the quality of Bondi's arguments that was impressive, it was the way she delivered them. There was a quiet authority in her voice that made each point sound irrefutable, and every time Barrett tried to push back, Bondi's responses left no room for doubt. What had started as a simple exchange of arguments quickly evolved into an intense battle of wills. It was clear that this wasn't a one-sided case where one party would dominate the other. What had begun as a predictable case where the legal heavyweight was expected to sweep the floor with her opponent had now transformed into a courtroom, drama where the stakes were high and every word mattered. The energy in the room was changing. No longer was it a case where Judge Barrett was in control. Now it was anyone's game. As Barrett's attempts to regain control became more desperate, the courtroom began to take notice. The tension in the air was palpable. Lawyers and spectators, who had initially thought they were witnessing a simple formality, were now leaning in, eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Bondi's arguments were taking on more and more weight as they gained momentum, while Barrett, who had expected an easy win, found herself on the defensive, trying to respond to each point with greater urgency. The balance of power in the courtroom was shifting, and it wasn't just a small adjustment, it was a dramatic change in the way the case was being perceived. Bondi's legal acumen was starting to shine through in a way that no one had anticipated. Her knowledge of the law was impeccable. Her reasoning sound and her ability to anticipate Barrett's every move made it clear that she was more than capable of handling herself in this courtroom battle. The more Bondi spoke, the more it became clear that Barrett had made a fundamental misjudgment in underestimating her opponent. At the start of the case, Barrett had assumed that Bondi would be an easy adversary. She had seen Bondi primarily through the lens of politics rather than law, and Barrett had mistakenly believed that Bondi's political background would be her greatest strength, an asset that would likely have little bearing on the legal arguments at hand. But Bondi, with her sharp legal mind, had proven Barrett wrong at every turn. The former Attorney General of Florida was not only holding her own, but actively outmaneuvering the seasoned Supreme Court judge. Bondi's brilliance in the courtroom wasn't about making grand, sweeping statements. It was about focusing on the details, the case law, and the specific nuances of the law that most would have overlooked. She wasn't interested in showmanship or winning a popularity contest. Instead, she was methodically dismantling the assumptions that Barrett had built her case upon, showing that the law didn't always work in the way that the judge had initially interpreted it. It was clear to everyone now that Barrett had severely underestimated her opponent, and that miscalculation was becoming more and more evident as the trial progressed. What made this shift in power even more striking was the way Bondi maintained her composure. In a situation where most people would have faltered, where the pressure of going up against a Supreme Court judge might have caused even the most experienced lawyers to crack, Bondi remained unshaken. Her quiet confidence and unwavering focus allowed her to consistently out-argue Barrett at every turn. Each legal precedent Bondi cited, each subtle distinction she made between different rulings, all added layers to her argument that made it more and more difficult for Barrett to dismiss. By the time the exchange reached its peak, it was abundantly clear. This was not the outcome anyone had predicted. What was supposed to be a straightforward legal battle had transformed into a lesson in humility for Judge Barrett. Bondi had turned the tables completely, showing that even the most respected legal minds can be outwitted by someone who understands the law on a deeper level. What had started as a case destined for Barrett's win was now a moment where Bondi's intellect had stolen the spotlight, and the judge could no longer ignore the brilliance of her adversary. In that moment, Barrett's initial confidence had been replaced by an undeniable recognition of Bondi's skill. This was no longer a case where Barrett could rely on her usual strategies to win. It was a case where she had to genuinely reckon with the legal genius sitting across from her. The courtroom had witnessed a powerful shift, one that would stay with everyone who saw it. Bondi wasn't just holding her own, she was changing the narrative, and it was clear that Judge Barrett's initial judgment of her had been entirely misguided. The moment the two women engaged in their fierce back and forth, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. It was the kind of exchange that everyone had been waiting for, an intense verbal sparring that would decide the trajectory of the case. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, with all her confidence and reputation, had long assumed that she would sail through this hearing without much trouble. She had initially underestimated Pam Bondi, dismissing her as a political figure rather than a serious legal contender. But as the case had unfolded, Bondi had proven time and time again that she wasn't to be underestimated. It was when Barrett, feeling the mounting pressure and seeing that her earlier strategy was no longer working, decided to try one final move to regain control. She posed a question, one she thought would stump Bondi, a question that would surely prove the holes in Bondi's argument. It was a tactic Barrett had used countless times before, turning the tables with a single, well-placed question that would force her opponent into a corner. But what Barrett didn't anticipate was that Bondi, instead of hesitating or backing down, would respond with a sharpness that cut through the tension in the room. Bondi's answer was clear, concise, and devastatingly effective. She didn't stumble over her words, and she didn't try to avoid the question. Instead, she addressed it head-on, pointing out not only the flaws in Barrett's own logic, but also offering a better, more coherent legal strategy that caught everyone off guard. It wasn't just that Bondi was defending her position. She was actively challenging Barrett's reasoning in a way that no one, least of all Barrett, had expected. Bondi's response was a masterstroke in legal strategy. She didn't just offer a counterpoint to Barrett's question, she reframed the entire argument, shifting the focus from what Barrett had assumed to be the central issue to a far more forward-thinking perspective. Bondi demonstrated an understanding of the case that was both deep and wide-ranging. Where Barrett's approach had been grounded in established precedents, Bondi had the foresight to bring up new, emerging legal principles that were in line with the future of legal interpretation. This was not just an intellectual victory for Bondi, it was a professional one. She had managed to turn the tables completely. By the time she finished speaking, there was a clear sense in the courtroom that the dynamic had shifted. Barrett, who had once been in control, now found herself on the defensive, her usual command of the situation slipping away. Bondi's response had been so compelling that even those who had originally sided with Barrett found themselves rethinking their positions. As the two women continued their exchange, it became evident that this was no longer a battle of egos or rhetorical one-upmanship. What had started as a case where Barrett's intellect and experience were assumed to dominate had turned into a genuine intellectual debate. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The tension that had initially been directed at Bondi, who had been underestimated and dismissed, had slowly started to turn toward Barrett. The courtroom, which had once buzzed with the assumption that Barrett's brilliance would carry the day, now buzzed with a sense of respect for Bondi's legal acumen. Bondi wasn't just holding her own. She was, quite frankly, outmaneuvering the judge. As she continued to present her case with clarity and precision, it became clear that Barrett's earlier dismissiveness had been misplaced. Barrett, known for her ability to dissect complex legal matters with ease, was now faced with a situation where she was being forced to reconsider her own reasoning. Each time Barrett attempted to assert dominance, Bondi's response was so well grounded in legal theory that it forced Barrett to pause and reflect. In these moments, the balance of power in the room seemed to tip. At first, Barrett had approached the case with a sense of superiority, assuming that her experience and reputation would carry her through. But as the proceedings wore on, Barrett was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that she was up against a far more formidable opponent than she had anticipated. Bondi was not merely a politician playing at law. She was a seasoned legal strategist with a sharp mind and a deep understanding of the issues at hand. What had begun as a battle where Barrett was clearly the dominant force had now become a true contest of legal minds. The courtroom, which had once been filled with the expectation that Barrett would easily overpower Bondi, now held a sense of quiet anticipation. Bondi's arguments, which had initially been dismissed as weak or politically motivated, had proven to be grounded in a deep understanding of the law. As Barrett's attempts to regain control grew more desperate, it became clear to everyone in the room that Bondi wasn't just winning the battle, she was completely reshaping the narrative. The shift in the atmosphere was so profound that it could be felt in the smallest moments of the exchange. The way the lawyers in the room looked at each other, the way the audience leaned in, hanging on every word that Bondi spoke. The courtroom, which had once been dominated by Barrett's presence, was now alive with the intellectual energy of Bondi's arguments. Barrett, once a commanding figure, now found herself in the difficult position of having to defend her own reasoning in the face of someone who was proving to be a more effective legal mind than she had initially given credit for. The judge's sharp, pointed remarks, which had once been a hallmark of her style, now seemed less cutting and more defensive. She had been caught off guard, and as much as she tried to reassert herself, the weight of Bondi's responses made it harder and harder to maintain control. By the time their exchange reached its climax, it was clear that Barrett's attempts to dominate the conversation had all but faded into the background. Bondi had taken control of the narrative. The respect in the room had shifted from being directed at Barrett to being directed at Bondi. What had once been a case where Bondi was expected to play a minor role had turned into a moment where she had proven herself to be a legal force to be reckoned with. For Barrett, this was a humbling experience. It wasn't just that she had underestimated her opponent. It was that she had failed to recognize the depth of Bondi's legal intellect and the power of her approach. In that moment, Barrett realized that Bondi wasn't just a political figure. She was a legal mind in her own right, capable of holding her own against even the most esteemed legal professionals. As the exchange drew to a close, the room was silent, save for the sound of the judge's gavel. But in that silence was a deep, unspoken recognition of the profound shift that had just occurred. Bondi had turned what should have been a straightforward legal battle into a moment of intellectual victory that would be remembered for a long time. And Judge Barrett, no matter how hard she tried to regain control, had been outmaneuvered in a way that no one, not even she, could deny. By the end of the trial, it was abundantly clear Pam Bondi had completely outsmarted Judge Amy Coney Barrett in a way that no one had expected. The courtroom, which had initially been filled with a sense of certainty that Barrett's reputation and experience would guarantee her victory, had shifted by the time the trial concluded. What had begun as an assumed landslide in Barrett's favor had transformed into an intellectual battle where Bondi's legal mastery and sharpness had taken center stage. Barrett, long regarded as one of the brightest minds on the U.S. Supreme Court, was undeniably humbled by the experience. She didn't suffer a humiliating defeat. Instead, she faced a moment of realization, a wake-up call that the case wasn't as simple as she had once believed. Bondi, who had been dismissed as an opponent not worthy of Barrett's full attention, had proven herself in the most dramatic and unexpected way. Her brilliance was undeniable, and her performance in the courtroom was nothing short of a masterclass in legal strategy and intellectual rigor. She hadn't just held her own against one of the most formidable legal minds in the country. She had outmaneuvered her, strategically dismantling Barrett's arguments with such precision and clarity that it left a lasting impact on everyone in the room. What made this victory even more remarkable was the context in which it took place. Bondi, despite her extensive legal background as the former Attorney General of Florida, had often been seen through the lens of her political career. Many had underestimated her, assuming that she lacked the depth or intellectual prowess to face off against someone with Barrett's reputation and standing. However, Bondi's performance in the courtroom shattered that preconceived notion. She had not only proven her worth as a legal expert, but had also demonstrated an ability to think strategically and engage with the law in a way that few could match. Barrett, who had entered the courtroom with complete confidence, quickly realized that this case was not going to be the straightforward victory she had anticipated. Each time she tried to regain control of the narrative, Bondi was there presenting her arguments with unmatched clarity and legal sophistication. The judge, once so sure of her position, began to feel the sting of being outmaneuvered at every turn. The subtle brilliance of Bondi's strategy left Barrett no choice but to recognize that the former Attorney General was not just another political figure. It was clear that Bondi was a formidable legal mind in her own right. The takeaway from this story is simple yet powerful. Never judge someone based on preconceived notions. It's easy to assume that we can predict who will succeed or fail based on external appearances, backgrounds, or reputations. Confidence is certainly important, but arrogance can be a dangerous pitfall. Barrett's initial assumptions about Bondi's capabilities were rooted in the idea that she, as a Supreme Court judge with years of experience, would easily have the upper hand. In the end, however, it wasn't Barrett's experience or reputation that mattered. It was Bondi's preparation, her deep understanding of the law, and her ability to stand firm in the face of a powerful adversary. Pam Bondi's victory wasn't just about the legal win in the courtroom. It was about something much deeper. She had overcome the doubts of those around her and proven that brilliance can come from unexpected places. The courtroom had witnessed a stunning display of legal mastery that went beyond the case at hand. Bondi's performance changed the way people viewed her, not just as a politician, but as a legal strategist and intellectual powerhouse. Her victory had the kind of impact that lingered long after the trial concluded. It was the kind of win that left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it, a moment that would be remembered as a turning point in the case. This story serves as a reminder that brilliance does not always come from the most obvious sources. It's not always the person with the most prestigious title or the longest resume who ends up on top. Sometimes it's the person who quietly prepares, who keeps their head down, and who knows how to rise to the occasion when it matters most. Bondi was not the obvious choice to win this battle, and yet by the end of the trial, she had done more than simply hold her own. She had dominated. Her victory was a lesson in the power of quiet confidence and the importance of trusting in one's own abilities, no matter what others might think. The courtroom had witnessed the unexpected, and in doing so, it offered a valuable lesson for everyone present. Bondi's legal expertise had shone through in a way that no one could ignore, And Barrett, who had once thought of her opponent as an easy challenge, had learned the hard way that assumptions can be a dangerous thing. In that moment, it was clear that Bondi had not just won the case. She had won the respect of those who had once doubted her. In the end, this case was a powerful reminder that brilliance can come from anyone, no matter their background or reputation. The idea that success is determined by the obvious qualifications or the most recognized name in the room was shattered in this trial. Sometimes, it's the person who is underestimated, the one who flies under the radar, who rises to the occasion and surprises everyone, including themselves. Bondi's victory proved that brilliance is not limited by expectations or preconceived notions. It's a matter of preparation, intellect, and the courage to stand up when it counts. So the next time you find yourself facing a challenge, remember Pam Bondi's remarkable victory. It's not about who you think will win based on the surface. It's about how you rise to the occasion when your moment arrives. Just like Bondi, you might surprise everyone, including yourself. You might just be the one to turn the tables when no one expects it. So, what's your next move? Will you be ready? When your moment comes,